was a chilly autumn afternoon, the kind of day when the sun's weak rays struggled to break through the thick, gray clouds that clung to the sky. The air was crisp, carrying the rich, earthy scent of fallen leaves and damp soil. The woods, near Emma's small village, were alive with the quiet, whispering sounds of the wind rustling through the branches, shaking the last few golden leaves from their perches. Emma, a 12-year-old girl with bright, curious eyes and a fearless spirit, loved exploring these woods. She had a small wicker basket slung over her arm, half filled with wildflowers she had picked for her mother. She hummed a soft tune as she moved through the dense underbrush, her rubber boots crunching on the carpet of dry leaves beneath her feet. But then, just as she reached for a cluster of bright yellow daisies peeking through the twisted roots of an old oak tree, she heard it, a faint, desperate whisper. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The sound was so soft, so weak that at first she thought it was just the wind brushing through the trees, or perhaps the distant cry of a bird. She tilted her head, holding her breath, her ears straining to catch the sound again. For a long, tense moment, there was only the gentle rustle of the leaves and the distant cawing of a crow. Emma exhaled, shaking her head with a small, nervous laugh. "Just the wind," she whispered to herself, bending down to pick the daisies. But then it came again, a soft, trembling voice like the final breath of a fading spirit. This time it was clearer, sharper, a weak, choked plea for help. "Please, help me." Emma's heart leapt into her throat. She spun around, her wide, frightened eyes scanning the dense, shadowy woods around her. The sound had come from deeper in the forest, where the trees grew taller, their thick branches intertwined to form a dark, twisted canopy overhead. She hesitated, her small hands tightening around the handle of her basket, her mind racing. Every cautionary tale she had ever heard about the dangers of the woods flashed through her thoughts. Stories of wild animals, of hunters with sharp, gleaming traps, of strange, whispering shadows that vanished in the mist. But then the voice came. Again, a weak, trembling gasp that seemed to cut through the very air around her. "Please, don't leave me." Without another thought, Emma took a deep, steadying breath and stepped into the darker part of the woods, her boots crunching loudly on the thick, wet carpet of leaves. The trees closed in around her, their twisted, knotted roots jutting up from the ground like the grasping fingers of long-forgotten spirits. The whisper grew louder as she pushed her way through the tangled underbrush, her small hands brushing aside sharp, scratchy branches that snagged at her clothes and scratched at her skin. She ducked beneath a low-hanging branch, her heart pounding in her chest as the whisper grew clearer, closer. Finally, she stumbled into a small, shadowy clearing, her breath catching in her throat as she pushed aside a thick cluster of bushes. There, half buried in the cold, damp earth, lay an elderly man. Emma's eyes widened in shock, her small hands flying to her mouth as she took a shaky step back. The man's face was ghostly pale, his thin gray hair matted with dirt and leaves. His clothes were soaked through, covered in mud and torn in several places, his bony, shaking hands clutching weakly at the wet, leaf-strewn ground. His eyes, deep sunken hollows filled with pain and fear, met hers. His cracked, trembling lips parted slightly, his chest heaving with each shallow, ragged breath. "Help me," he whispered again, his voice little more than a weak, choking gasp. Emma felt a cold, sharp chill spread through her chest, her heart thundering in her ears as she took a hesitant step closer, her small, trembling hands reaching out to the man's shivering form. But before her fingers could brush his cold, clammy skin, the man's head slumped forward, his eyes rolling back into his head as his final, desperate whisper faded into a ragged, choking breath. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat as a terrible, chilling thought crossed her mind. Had she come too late to save him? Emma's heart pounded in her chest, the rapid, panicked beats echoing in her ears as she stared at the old man's limp, motionless form. She felt frozen, her small, trembling hands hovering in the chilly air, unsure whether to reach out or run for help. For a long, breathless moment, the only sounds, the dense, shadowy woods were the whisper of the wind through the trees, and the slow, steady drip of water from the branches above. She took a shaky step back, her boot crunching loudly on a brittle, dry leaf, the sound startling her like a gunshot in the eerie silence. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her wide, frightened eyes never leaving the old man's pale, dirt-streaked face. "No, he can't be gone. Not like this." Summoning every bit of courage she had, Emma dropped to her knees beside the frail, half-buried figure, her small, trembling hands gently brushing the wet, muddy leaves from his shivering shoulders. She leaned in closer, her breath fogging in the chilly air as she strained to hear even the faintest hint of life in his shallow, rattling breaths. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear and desperation. "Please, wake. I'm here to help you. Just hold on." For a long, agonizing moment, there was no response, just the cold, damp silence of the forgotten woods. Emma felt hot tears prick the corners of her eyes, her small, trembling fingers tightening around the old man's thin, bony arm as a terrible, hopeless feeling spread through her chest. But then, just as she was about to give up, the man's eyes flickered open, his thin, cracked lips parting in a weak, trembling gasp. Emma's heart leapt in her chest, a tiny flicker of hope sparking in her mind. The old man's wide, bloodshot eyes locked onto hers, his thin, frail body shivering violently in the cold, damp earth. His fingers twitched weakly against her small, muddy hands, his chest rising and falling in short, ragged gasps as he struggled to speak. "Don't leave me," he choked out, his voice little more than a faint, trembling whisper. "Please, they'll come back. They'll bury me for good." Emma's breath caught in her throat, her small, shaking hands tightening around his thin, bony shoulders as she leaned in closer, her wide, terrified eyes searching his pale, haunted face for any sign of hope, any hint that he might still survive. "This nightmare. Who did this to you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. "Who tried to bury you?" The old man's head rolled weakly to the side, his sunken, bloodshot eyes staring blankly at the dark, tangled branches above. His thin, cracked lips moved slowly, his voice a faint, shuddering breath that barely reached Emma's ears. "Trust no one," he gasped, his trembling fingers tightening around her small, shaking hands. They want my money. My secret. They'll kill anyone who finds me." Emma felt a cold, sharp chill spread through her chest, her heart thundering in her ears as the terrible reality of the situation began to sink in. She had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined, a secret so dark, so twisted, that it had nearly cost this man his life. But who?" she whispered, her wide, terrified eyes locked onto the old man's trembling face as she desperately searched his fading, haunted gaze for answers. "Who did this to you?" The old man's head slumped forward, his cracked, trembling lips parting in a weak, shuddering breath as his thin, bony fingers slowly loosened their grip on her hands. "Beware. The ones who smile in the shadows," he choked out, his voice little more than a faint, gasping whisper. They will come for you, too." Before Emma could respond, the old man's eyes rolled back into his head, his final, shuddering breath escaping his cracked, bleeding lips as his frail, broken body fell limp in her trembling arms. Emma felt a sharp, cold wave of fear crash over her, her small, muddy hands shaking as she slowly released the man's lifeless form, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked on his pale, dirt-streaked face as a single, terrible thought echoed in her mind. If his killers found out that she had seen him, that she had heard his final, desperate words, they would come for her too. Emma's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she spun around, her wide, terrified eyes scanning the dense, shadowy trees behind her. The crack of a snapped branch still echoed in her ears, sharp and unnatural in the quiet, misty woods. She felt her heart racing, her small, muddy hands trembling as she took a shaky step back, her boots sinking into the damp, leaf-covered ground. For a long, tense moment, the only sounds were the distant cawing of crows and the soft, rustling whispers of the wind through the twisted branches above. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with fear and confusion as she struggled to decide what to do. Should she run? Should she hide? Should she stay and try to help the old man, even though his lifeless, pale face told her it was already too late? But then, just as she felt the icy fingers of panic begin to close around her small, trembling heart, she heard it. A low, grumbling voice, rough and gravelly, cutting through the cold, misty air like the growl of a hungry wolf. "Did you hear that?" The voice whispered, harsh and tense, the sound sending a cold, sharp chill down Emma's spine. "I swear I heard something, over there, by the clearing." Emma's breath caught in her throat, her wide, terrified eyes darting to the thick cluster of bushes beside her. Without a second thought, she dropped to her knees, her small, trembling hands scrambling to push aside the sharp, scratchy branches as she cooed. The taller man let out a low, bitter laugh, his sharp, dark eyes glinting with cruel amusement, as he nudged the old man's limp, motionless form with the toe of his mud-caked boot. "Oh, he didn't get far," he sneered, his thin, cracked lips curling into a cruel smile as he glanced down at the half-buried figure in the cold, damp earth. "In fact, it looks like he didn't make it out of this little grave we dug for him after all." Emma felt her heart clench in her chest, her small, trembling hands gripping the cold, muddy ground beneath her, as she watched the two men lean over the old man's lifeless form, their cruel, mocking laughter echoing through the dark, misty woods. "Pathetic old fool," the taller man spat, his sharp, angular face twisted into a sneer as he reached down and grabbed the old man's thin, bony shoulder, shaking the lifeless body roughly. "Thought he could run from us. Thought he could hide his little secret. But now, look at him, nothing but a cold, forgotten corpse in the middle of nowhere." Emma felt hot tears sting the corners of her eyes, her small, mud-streaked fingers digging into the damp, leaf-covered ground as a wave of anger and fear washed over her. She wanted to scream, to shout at these cruel, heartless men, to tell them that the old man's life had meant something, that his final, desperate whispers would not be forgotten. But then, just as the shorter man leaned down to grab the old man's thin, bony wrist, a small, leather-bound journal slipped from the folds of the old man's torn, dirt-streaked coat, landing with a soft, muffled thud on the wet, leaf-strewn ground. The taller man froze, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing as he reached down and snatched the journal from the cold, damp earth, his thin, cracked lips curling into a cruel, knowing smile as he flipped through the worn, yellowed pages, his rough, calloused fingers trembling with excitement. "Well, well," he whispered, his dark, cruel eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation as he held the small, leather-bound journal up to the weak, gray light filtering through the twisted branches above. "Looks like our old friend left us a little parting gift, his final words, his final secret." Emma's heart raced as she pressed herself flat against the cold, damp earth, her small, muddy hands trembling as the rough, scratchy branches of the bushes dug into her skin. She felt her breath catch in her throat, her wide, terrified eyes locked on the two men in the clearing, their dark, shadowy figures outlined against the pale, misty light filtering through the twisted branches above. The taller man, still clutching the old leather-bound journal in his thin, calloused hands, flipped through the yellowed pages with a wicked, greedy grin on his sharp, angular face. His dark, piercing eyes gleamed with anticipation as he ran his long, bony fingers over the hastily scrawled notes, symbols, and crude, hand-drawn maps that filled the journal's brittle, crumbling pages. "Looks like the old fool wasn't as clever as he thought," he sneered, his thin, cracked lips curling into a cruel smile as he turned another worn, yellowed page. "He must have known we'd find this. He must have known we'd come for him eventually." The shorter man, his broad, muscular shoulders hunched against the cold, let out a low, bitter laugh, his sharp, calculating eyes darting around the clearing as if expecting someone, or something, to emerge from the dark, twisted trees around them. "Yeah, but he still tried to run," the shorter man spat, his deep, gravelly voice filled with anger and frustration. "He still thought he could keep his little secret from us, but now look at him, cold and lifeless, just another forgotten corpse in the middle of nowhere." Emma felt hot tears sting the corners of her eyes, her small, mud-streaked fingers clenching into tight fists as she fought to keep her breathing slow and quiet, her heart thundering in her chest as the two men stepped closer to the old man's lifeless, half-buried form. She had to do something. She couldn't just stay hidden in the bushes, watching in silent horror as these cruel, heartless men picked over the old man's final desperate secrets, like vultures tearing at a fresh kill. But what could she do? She was just a small, frightened girl, alone and unarmed in the middle of a dark, forgotten forest. Her only ally, a cold, lifeless body slowly sinking into the damp, leaf-strewn earth beside her. But then, just as the taller man flipped to the final page of the old man's journal, his dark, greedy eyes narrowing as he leaned in closer to the faint, scrawled writing, Emma's sharp, panicked mind latched onto a desperate, dangerous idea. She carefully reached down, her small, trembling fingers closing around a thick, jagged branch half buried in the wet, muddy ground beside her. She felt the rough, splintered wood bite into her palms as she tightened her grip, her heart pounding in her chest as she slowly, silently pulled the branch free, her wide, terrified eyes never leaving the two men in the clearing. The taller man let out a low, bitter chuckle as he traced his long, bony fingers over the final line of the journal's yellowed, crumbling pages, his thin, cracked lips curling into a wicked, knowing smile. "Well, well," he whispered, his dark, cruel eyes glinting with anticipation as he held the journal up to the pale, misty light filtering through the twisted branches above. "Looks like our old friend had one last trick up his sleeve, one final riddle for us to solve." The shorter man leaned in closer, his sharp, calculating eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the faint, hastily scrawled writing on the final crumbling page. "What does it say?" he growled, his deep, gravelly voice filled with anger and impatience. "What did the old fool try to hide from us?" The taller man let out another bitter, mocking laugh, his thin, cracked lips curling into a wicked, knowing smile as he read the final haunting line aloud. "Beware the ones who smile in the shadows. They will come for you too." Emma felt a cold, sharp chill spread through her chest, her heart thundering in her ears as the taller man's cruel, mocking laughter echoed through the dark, twisted trees around them. But then, before the men could react, Emma leapt to her feet, her small, mud-streaked hands clenching the thick, jagged branch tightly as she burst from the bushes, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she swung the branch wildly at the two men, her terrified scream slicing through the cold, misty air like a knife. The taller man stumbled back, his thin, bony fingers releasing their tight grip on the old man's journal as he threw his arms up in a desperate attempt to shield himself from Emma's frenzied attack. The shorter man let out a sharp, angry shout, his broad, muscular shoulders twisting as he tried to grab the small, terrified girl swinging the heavy, splintered branch with all the strength her trembling arms could muster. But before he could reach her, Emma turned and ran, her small, muddy boots pounding against the damp, leaf-strewn ground as she tore through the dark, twisted trees, her breath coming in short. Panicked gasps as the two men's furious shouts echoed behind her. Emma's heart pounded like a wild drum in her chest as she crashed through the dense, twisted underbrush, her small, mud-streaked hands clutching the thick, jagged branch she had ripped from the ground in her desperate flight. The sharp, brittle branches scratched at her arms and legs, tearing at her clothes as she stumbled over roots and stones, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Behind her, the angry shouts of the two men grew louder, their heavy, mud-caked boots crunching on the wet, leaf-strewn ground as they barreled through the dark, misty woods in furious pursuit. "Get back here, you little brat!" one of the men roared, his deep, gravelly voice echoing through the twisted trees like the growl of an enraged beast. "You can't hide from us, we'll find you." Emma felt a sharp, cold wave of terror crash over her, her wide, terrified eyes darting left and right as she searched for a place to hide, a place to escape, some tiny sliver of hope in the dark, tangled maze of the forest. But everywhere she looked, the twisted, grasping branches seemed to close in around her, their sharp, jagged limbs reaching for her like the bony fingers of long-dead spirits. She stumbled over a thick, gnarled root jutting up from the cold, damp earth, her small mud-covered hands flying out to catch herself as she crashed to the ground, her heart leaping into her throat as the sharp, splintered branch she had been holding slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering against a pile of wet, rotting leaves beside her. For a moment she lay there, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, her small, mud-streaked hands digging into the cold, wet earth beneath her as the men's heavy, crashing footsteps grew closer, their angry, breathless shouts cutting through the misty air like the howls of a hunting pack. "She's close. I can hear her." The taller man snarled, his thin, sharp face twisted into a mask of rage as he pushed his way through a thick cluster of bushes, his long, bony fingers tearing at the sharp, scratchy branches in his path. She couldn't have gotten far. "Spread out and find her." Emma felt hot tears sting the corners of her eyes, her small, mud-streaked fingers clenching into tight fists as she forced herself to her feet, her heart racing in her chest as she stumbled forward, her boots slipping and sliding on the wet, muddy ground as she fought to stay on her feet. She had to keep moving. She had to get away from these men, to find some place to hide, to lose herself in the dark, twisted maze of the forest before they caught up to her. But every step she took seemed to echo in the cold, misty air, her heavy, panicked breaths blending with the sharp, snapping sounds of branches breaking. Emma's heart raced as she stumbled through the thick, twisted forest, her small, mud-streaked hands clutching the leather-bound journal she had snatched from the clearing. The cold, damp air burned in her lungs, and her legs felt like lead. As she fought to keep moving, her wide, terrified eyes darting left and right as the dark, shadowy trees seemed to close in around her. She could still hear the men's furious shouts echoing through the twisted branches behind her, their heavy, mud-caked boots crashing through the wet, leaf-strewn ground, like the thunder of a distant storm. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was so close to finding the answers she needed. Emma clutched the old, battered journal tighter to her chest, her small, trembling fingers gripping the rough, cracked leather cover as she ducked beneath a thick, gnarled branch, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she stumbled over a twisted, half-buried root jutting up from the cold, damp earth beneath her. She had no idea where she was going. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, to put as much distance between herself and the men as possible, to find a safe place to hide and catch her breath before they caught up to her. But then, just as she stumbled into a small, shadowy clearing surrounded by thick, twisted trees and thick, scratchy underbrush, she felt her foot slip on a patch of wet, moss-covered stones, her heart leaping into her throat as she crashed to the ground, the old leather-bound journal slipping from her trembling fingers and landing with a soft, muffled thud on the damp, leaf-strewn ground beside her. For a long, breathless moment, Emma lay there, her small, trembling body half buried in the cold, wet earth, her heart racing in her chest as she struggled to catch her breath, her wide, terrified eyes locked on the thick, twisted trees surrounding the tiny, shadowy clearing. But then, as she forced herself to her hands and knees, her small, mud-streaked fingers closing around the old, battered journal beside her, she felt something strange beneath her palm, a cold, hard, metallic object half buried in the wet, muddy ground. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her wide, frightened eyes darting to the small, rusted metal box her fingers had brushed against. The thick, corroded lid covered in strange, hastily scrawled symbols and crude, hand-drawn maps that seemed to match the strange, confusing notes and drawings in the old man's journal. She felt a cold, sharp chill spread through her chest, her small, trembling hands closing around the heavy, rusted box as she pulled it free from the wet, muddy ground, her heart racing in her chest as she flipped open the thick, corroded lid. Inside, nestled, among the crumbling remains of old yellowed papers and brittle, cracked leather pouches, was a small, ornate key, its intricate, twisting design covered in thick, dark stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Emma's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she carefully reached down, her small, trembling fingers closing around the cold, heavy key, her heart thundering in her chest as she held it up to the weak gray light filtering through the twisted branches above. The key felt cold and heavy in her hand, its sharp, jagged teeth biting into her palm as she carefully tucked it into the pocket of her torn, mud-streaked jacket, her mind racing with questions as she grabbed the old, battered journal and stumbled to her feet, her small, trembling body swaying unsteadily as the men's furious shouts grew louder, closer, their heavy, crashing footsteps pounding against the wet, leaf-strewn ground like the drums of a distant, approaching storm. She had to keep moving. She couldn't let them catch her, not now, not when she had the key, the journal, the final pieces of the old man's desperate, tragic puzzle clutched tightly in her small, trembling hands. But as she turned and stumbled deeper into the dense, shadowy forest, her small, mud-streaked hands clenching the old, battered journal tightly to her chest, she felt a cold, sharp chill spread through her chest, her heart racing. In her chest as a chilling thought crossed her mind. What if the men weren't the only ones searching for the old man's final, desperate secret? Emma's heart felt like it might explode in her chest as the rough, calloused hand tightened around her thin, trembling wrist, yanking her back into the thick, shadowy underbrush. She gasped, her small, mud-streaked fingers clawing at the damp, leaf-strewn ground as she struggled to break free. Her wide, terrified eyes locking onto the dark, twisted face of the man looming over her. His sharp, angular features were twisted into a cruel, mocking smile, his dark, glittering eyes filled with wicked anticipation as he leaned in closer, his hot, sour breath washing over Emma's pale, terrified face. "Thought you could run from us, did you?" he sneered, his thin, cracked lips curling into a wicked grin as he tightened his grip on her wrist, his long, bony fingers digging into her skin like the sharp, twisted claws of a hungry predator. "Thought you could slip away into the woods and disappear like some frightened little rabbit?" Emma felt hot tears sting the corners of her eyes, her small, mud-streaked fingers clenching into tight fists as she struggled to break free, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the man's cruel, mocking laughter echoed through the twisted trees around them. But then, just as the man leaned in closer, his sharp, angular face mere inches from hers, Emma felt her small, trembling fingers brush against the thick, jagged branch she had dropped in her desperate flight through the dark, tangled forest. Without a second thought, she tightened her grip on the rough, splintered wood, her heart racing in her chest as she swung the branch upward with all the strength her thin, trembling arms could muster, the sharp, jagged end smashing into the side of the man's head with a sickening, bone-crunching crack. The man let out a sharp, agonized shout, his dark, glittering eyes rolling back into his head as he stumbled backward, his thin, bony fingers releasing their tight grip on Emma's wrist as he crashed to the ground in a twisted, broken heap, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he clutched the side of his bleeding, battered head. Emma stumbled backward, her small, mud-streaked hands clenching the thick, splintered branch tightly as she fought to catch her breath, her heart racing in her chest as the man's furious, pain-filled groans echoed through the dark, misty air around them. For a long, breathless moment, Emma stood there, her small, trembling body swaying unsteadily as she stared down at the man writhing in agony on the cold, damp ground before her, his sharp, angular face twisted into a mask of rage and pain as he clutched his bleeding head. But then, just as she turned, to flee deeper into the dense, shadowy forest, her small, trembling fingers still clutching the old, battered journal she had snatched from the clearing, she heard the low, ragged voice of the old man echo in her mind, his final, desperate words whispered in the cold, misty air as he lay half-buried in the wet, muddy earth. "Beware the ones who smile in the shadows. They will come for you, too." Emma felt a cold, sharp chill spread through her chest, her wide, terrified eyes darting to the thick, twisted trees around her as a dark, shadowy figure slowly emerged from the mist, his sharp, angular face twisted into a wicked, knowing smile as his dark, cruel eyes locked onto hers. It was the other man, the taller, crueler of the two, his long, bony fingers still clutching the old man's battered, blood-stained journal as he slowly stepped forward, his thin, cracked lips curling into a cruel, mocking grin as he reached for the small, terrified girl trembling before him. "Ah, so you found the key," he whispered, his dark, glittering eyes gleaming with wicked anticipation as he slowly closed the distance between them, his thin, bony fingers reaching for the pocket of Emma's torn, mud-streaked jacket. "You have no idea what you're holding, do you?" Emma stumbled backward, her small, trembling fingers tightening around the thick, splintered branch in her hand, as the man's cruel, mocking laughter echoed through the twisted trees around them, his dark, glittering eyes gleaming with wicked anticipation as he reached for her. But then, just as his long, bony fingers closed around her thin, trembling wrist, Emma felt a cold, sharp rush of adrenaline flood her small, trembling body, her heart racing in her chest as she swung the thick, splintered branch upward once more, the sharp, jagged end smashing into the man's twisted, leering face with a sickening, bone-crunching crack. The man let out a sharp, agonized shout, his dark, glittering eyes rolling back into his head as he stumbled backward, his thin, bony fingers releasing their tight grip on Emma's wrist as he crashed to the ground beside his writhing, bleeding partner, their pained, breathless groans echoing through the dark, misty air around them. For a long, breathless moment, Emma stood there, her small, trembling body swaying unsteadily as she clutched the old, battered journal to her chest, her heart racing in her chest as the two men's agonized, breathless moans slowly faded into silence, their twisted, broken bodies lying motionless on the cold, damp ground before her.